This lecture is going to be on human genetics. So we're going to talk about just this is an overview of what we're going to talk about. If you want to stop the video right now and just take notes here, and then that way you can listen, or we can go through one at a time, which I'm going to do, all right? So the first thing we're going to talk about is disorders that are carried by the recessive allele. We've already talked about this a little bit because the recessive allele, of course, if you have the problem, you have to be little a. Some examples of this are cystic fibrosis, color blindness, which we talked about with sex-linked traits, and something called PKU. So let's just talk about those diseases. You probably are familiar with cystic fibrosis. It's basically like you have pneumonia all the time, but it's a genetic disorder. And what that causes is, of course, your lungs get damaged from having so much fluid in them all the time, and it, of course, causes you not to take in oxygen like you need to, or get rid of your carbon dioxide as well, so your lung function is low. In years past, people would die fairly early from this, but of course with new drugs and so forth, it's a little bit better prognosis for people. Still, it's fairly hard going. Color blindness, we've already talked about. PKU is a very common, well, it's not that common, but it's something that they test babies for almost always now, and they do it by a little capillary blood test when the baby is born. What PKU is phenylketonuria, and what that is building up ketones in the brain, which causes mental retardation. Mostly this happens in the first 5 years of life, and this is from the improper breakdown of phenylalanine, which is one of the amino acids. A way to make this less is to control the intake of phenylalanine, which is fairly difficult because phenylalanine is in a lot of protein sources, beans, meats, etc. So basically the person has to eat like proteins that do not have phenylalanine in them, and it makes for pretty dull going. So you can imagine having a little kid with that. However, if you do it for the first 5 years of their life, their brain will form mostly normally. The main problem with this is that it is common, it happens in utero. So by the time you're born, you've already had a little bit of time of brain formation with the buildup of phenylalanine, most likely because pregnant women eat a lot of protein generally to support their pregnancy. All right, so those are just some examples. There's actually literally tons of examples of the recessive allele causing problems. That's probably the most common thing. There are some other disorders that are carried by the dominant allele. What that would mean is that you would have to have both dominant genes or just one dominant gene. So this is, you would imagine that if somebody has it, of course, they're going to be passing it down. And so where you see this disorder, unlike this one, somebody can have it and pass it down and not know that they have it, right? With the recessive allele, you could be heterozygous and you'd be normal, and you could pass that to your offspring. In this case, with the dominant allele, you would have it. So the disorders that are passed by this are either like Huntington's disease that occurs late in your life, so you might have it, but you don't know you have it till later, or something that doesn't really affect your reproductive effort, like dwarfism. So both of these diseases, Huntington's disease is kind of like a breakdown of the brain. It's kind of like Parkinson's in a way, like it starts just deteriorating your brain, eyesight, motor skills, etc. And it usually onset is somewhere in your late 40s, and so a lot of times people would have been reproductive. An example of a person that had this was Woody Guthrie. I don't know if anybody knows about him, and he also passed it to his son, Arlo Guthrie. They were folk singers. Another person that you might have heard of was on that show House. 13 had it, and she was all freaked out about it. You might remember that part of the show if you ever saw it. And dwarfism, of course, used to be something that people cared about. The reproductive effort might have been low, but in this, now people don't really discriminate, and so dwarfism is becoming a little bit more common. because, you know, if you have the allele for it, you're going to pass that along. All right. The other thing is that the disorder is related to chromosome assortment or structure. So one big one is something that we call non-disjunction, and this is what causes Down syndrome. So let's look at what causes that. So non-disjunction is when I just drew two sets of homologous chromosomes so that you could kind of see. This would be the original cell. And in the gametes that are produced, because what happens in this case, the way I've drawn it here, is that these two would not separate during the meiotic divisions. Instead, they would be stuck together. So this is something that happens more commonly when people get older. Sometimes there's a genetic component to it, depending on what the factor is. But anyway, these two would stick together. And when they stick together, then when they are separated in the process of meiosis, they're going to go together. So in my final cells, I will end up with one extra in each of these cells, and I'll end up with one less in each of these cells. So that's called non-disjunction. It means you have an extra chromosome. Down syndrome is having an extra chromosome 21. All right. Now, just some of the combinations. So this is a normal cell. So I have, you know, two homologous chromosomes. I normally would have them separating and have one of each per cell. So my possibilities of combinations of a normal person with a non-disjunction person are either this, which is not viable because I don't have a homologous set with this one. So generally speaking, not having one chromosome is a issue in terms of you know, the organism surviving. And you'll have another set, like these cells and these cells joining, that is what we call trisomy. In other words, you have three of one type of chromosome, and all your other chromosomes would be regular homologous pairs. All right, this can also happen with sex chromosomes. So I could end up with cells that have two X chromosomes, a cell that only has one X chromosome. And in this case, because remember that one X chromosome turns off per cell, this person actually is viable. In other words, they grow up and become, you know, a person. However, they will have some serious problems, usually somewhat mentally retarded, a little short, squatty kind of look to them, and usually not sexually viable. But anyway, you can have all the possibilities that you could think of really with the sex chromosomes because of the fact that only one X chromosome needs to be there. All right, so you could have XYY, you can have XXXX, you know, if both people were non-disjunction, etc. Now, Down syndrome is also caused by just a piece of a chromosome. So not the whole thing sticking together, but just half of it or like a little piece of it. And that is called translocation. So down here, if we were looking at this, instead of both of these sticking together completely and going over here, I would end up with like a little piece of that and a little piece of this over here. And these cells would still be non-viable, but these cells would have, when I get down to here, would have 2.5, say, chromosomes. So that's not trisomy, but it's still a problem. So that's translocation. Other things that can happen are things like deletions. So I could have, let's say if this is a chromosome and I have one gene, I could just X out that gene. And if I did that, that may cause problems. Sometimes it causes big problems and sometimes it doesn't. An example is cat's cry syndrome. That's a disorder that happens with the development of the pharynx area, and basically that person has a lot of trouble, a lot of things missing that are necessary for it to live. Usually they don't live very long, and of course their cry sounds like a cat. That's where the name comes from. You can also have duplications. That is, I could have two genes. Instead, when I'm doing the copying process, a whole gene, it gets copied extra. And that sometimes can be not a bad thing, but sometimes, of course, it is. So that's kind of variable. And then you can have what they call an inversion. That is, a gene could break off and flip, And if that happened, of course, the reading of the genetic material to make proteins, which is what we'll talk about next, protein synthesis, would be really messed up. So that's usually like a deletion. So that would be not good. All right, let's talk about a couple of other things that are kind of interesting. One thing is, if we look at sickle cell anemia, let's just say sickle cell anemia is little a. Basically, if you have 2 of the sickle cell genes, you have full-blown sickle cell anemia. What the sickle cell anemia is, I'll show you what it looks like. So sickle cell anemia, we have normal blood cells, which are kind of disc shaped, and they go through the bloodstream easily. Oh, I thought it didn't look right. All right, you have normal ones, and then you have the sickle-celled ones. This is just because of 2 problems with amino acids in one hemoglobin problem, or one amino acid problem in the hemoglobin molecule of 2 hemoglobin molecules. So basically it's 2 amino acids that are missing. And that causes the sickle cell problem in cells. So these guys just don't go through the blood vessels as easily. They get kind of caught up on each other, and etc. And they cause, the breakdown of other red blood cells. They cause clumping. They cause accumulation in organs and stuff. And all of these problems down here. So this is in your book. You can kind of look it over. But the thing about sickle cell, so that's what I would call full-blown sickle cell, right? But if you're heterozygous, like these 2 carrier parents were, you have some sickle cells and some normal cells. And the normal cells usually make it so that you can, pretty much function normally. You may have some of the problems associated with sickle cell anemia, but usually, it's not full-blown, and you can live, a reasonably normal life. And the reason why this stays in the population, especially in tropical areas where there's a lot of mosquitoes, is because if you are capital A, I said resist malaria. That's incorrect. You get malaria. So not resist. You get malaria. So that would be bad, and so that would, kind of negate the population sort of moving in that direction. And if you are sickle cell, you are also going to be dying early, right? So both these guys die early. So what that means is people who are carrying the gene can actually make it, and it turns out that this is also offers some resistance to malaria. All right, so that is the carrier of the sickle cell gene is also resistant to malaria. Okay, so a couple other things. These are in your lab book. I wanted to mention the idea of a karyotype. A karyotype is just where they had cells doing cell division, and they were able to take cells that were in their coiled state. Remember, they coil up during prophase, and to try to determine the homologous sets of chromosomes. And so that took a lot of pictures of different types of cells. And anyway, they made these karyotypes. So this is an example of a normal female. 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y, and 2 of everything else. Notice that the autosomes are similar size and shape and banding, like we talked about. All right, and then this is a normal male. It would have 1 X and 1 Y. All right, but all the other ones are the autosomes. All right. Now, if you wanted to determine some problems like this one, you could look at, for example, this one is a Turner's female. That is, it has 1 X chromosome, no Y. So this would be XO, and this is definitely a genetic problem. There's other ones. These are in your book. This one would be trisomy cell number 13. So just check out these in the lab book and do the genetics problems. If you have any questions about genetics problems, make sure you Canvas chat me.